Linda Harrington was the kind of person who took great pride in her surroundings. Her home, situated in a pristine suburban neighborhood, was immaculate. Every hedge was trimmed, every flower bed meticulously arranged, and the grass was a vibrant shade of green that could have graced a magazine cover. She'd spent years ensuring that her life was orderly, controlled, and predictable. And that control extended beyond her front yard. Linda felt a deep, almost compulsive responsibility to maintain the integrity of her neighborhood. Anything that didn't fit into her world of symmetry and perfection was, in her eyes, a threat. That Friday afternoon was like any other. Linda stood by her kitchen window, sipping tea, feeling content as she surveyed her street. Her teenage daughter Emma was upstairs, busy with homework, and her husband Mark was out of town on a business trip. The soft hum of everyday life in the neighborhood comforted her. Kids playing, dogs barking in the distance, and the occasional passerby walking their pet. This was her sanctuary, her carefully curated world. But then she noticed something unusual. Across the street, a man, disheveled and dressed in old, worn clothing, wandered slowly along the sidewalk. His appearance was strikingly out of place in this well-kept suburb. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, and he carried a large, bulging backpack. Most notably, he was black. Linda felt a ripple of discomfort wash over her. She had lived in this neighborhood for years and had never seen anyone like him here before. Her stomach tightened. Linda kept her eyes on him as he paused by the corner, looking around as if he were searching for something. To her, it seemed like he didn't belong, like he was an intruder in her perfect bubble of safety. Her mind raced through a million possibilities, most of them dark and unsettling. What was he doing here? Was he lost? Or worse, was he scouting the area, planning to cause trouble? She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her heart beating faster. "There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. She described him to the dispatcher, her words tinged with fear and frustration. "He doesn't look like he belongs here, and I don't know what he's doing. I think the police should check on him." As she hung up the phone, she felt a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. On one hand, she believed she was protecting her community, but on the other, there was a nagging feeling deep down, a faint voice telling her that she might be overreacting. But she quickly pushed that thought aside. She had to be cautious. In times like these, you couldn't be too careful. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car appeared at the end of the street. Linda watched from behind her curtains as Officer Daniel Carter, a young officer she'd seen around town before, stepped out of the car. He walked calmly toward the man, his hand resting casually on his radio. Linda felt a slight pang of anxiety. What if this escalated? What if something went wrong? The man, who had been sitting on a bench by now, looked up as Officer Carter approached. Linda couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched closely as the officer spoke to him. The man didn't seem to resist. He nodded and gestured with his hands, explaining something. After a few minutes, Officer Carter stepped back, nodded, and returned to his car. Linda's stomach churned as she saw the man slowly rise to his feet, pick up his backpack, and walk down the street, disappearing around the corner. The police car followed behind him briefly before turning away. Linda exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. Whatever the man had been doing, it seemed to be over now. Yet, as she returned to her tea, something gnawed at her. The interaction between the man and Officer Carter had been surprisingly calm, almost respectful. The man hadn't been confrontational. He hadn't acted like someone who was up to no good, and the officer hadn't arrested him or even detained him. They had just talked. As the sun began to set, Linda found herself pacing around the house, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. Emma came downstairs for dinner, her headphones around her neck. "Everything okay, Mom?" Emma asked, noticing her mother's restless energy. Linda forced a smile. "Oh, everything's fine, sweetheart. Just a long day." But it wasn't fine. The more Linda thought about it, the more unsettled she became. Why hadn't Officer Carter arrested the man? Why hadn't the police taken him away? The story she'd built in her head, the one where she was protecting her neighborhood from some unseen danger, didn't seem to align with what had actually happened, and it bothered her. That night, Linda lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of the man kept replaying in her mind. His face, though tired, hadn't seemed menacing. In fact, he looked more lost than dangerous. What if he wasn't what she had assumed? What if he wasn't a threat at all? The next morning, as Linda sipped her coffee and stared out the window again, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull of curiosity. Who was that man? And why had she been so quick to judge him? The following day, Linda couldn't shake the thoughts from her head. She kept replaying the scene, her quick decision to call the police, Officer Carter's calm approach, and the man's unexpected composure. Something about it all felt off, and it left her more unsettled than she cared to admit. Yet, life in the neighborhood continued as if nothing had happened. The children played, neighbors waved at one another, and the world seemed as orderly as ever. But for Linda, the world had shifted ever so slightly, like a crack in the foundation that she couldn't ignore. Linda's day began as usual. She ran errands, spoke briefly with her neighbors, and tried to keep herself busy, hoping to distract her mind. But every time she closed her eyes, she could see the man's face, tired but not threatening, lost but not dangerous. She had been so certain that he didn't belong, that his mere presence was a disruption to her well-maintained life. But now, in the quiet moments between tasks, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been wrong. That afternoon, as she was folding laundry, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Officer Carter standing on her porch, his expression neutral, but polite. Linda felt her heart skip a beat. What could he want now? "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harrington," Officer Carter greeted her with a small nod. "I wanted to follow up with you regarding the call you made yesterday." Linda hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Oh yes, of course. Is there something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," he assured her. "I just wanted to check in and let you know about the situation. The man you saw yesterday, his name is Thomas. He's not a stranger to this area, though it may have seemed that way." Linda frowned, confused. "He's not a stranger? He doesn't live here, does he?" Officer Carter shook his head. "No, not anymore. But he grew up in this town, not too far from here actually. He's been through some tough times lately, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just passing through, reminiscing, I think. He had no intention of causing any harm." Linda's face flushed with embarrassment. She had been so quick to judge, so sure that this man was a threat, but it seemed there was more to his story than she had realized. "I see," she said quietly, looking down at her hands. "I didn't know." "It's understandable to feel concerned when you see something unfamiliar," Officer Carter said kindly, sensing her discomfort. "But I wanted to make sure you understood the situation. Thomas is struggling, yes, but he's not a danger to anyone." There was a long pause as Linda absorbed his words. She wanted to say something, to defend her actions, but she couldn't. Instead, she nodded, feeling a knot of guilt tightening in her chest. "Thank you for coming by, officer," she finally said, her voice softer now. "I appreciate you letting me know." After Officer Carter left, Linda closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. The man, Thomas, had a history here. He had once been part of this community, and yet she had seen him as nothing more than an outsider. She had acted out of fear and assumption, and now she felt ashamed. Later that day, as she sat at the dinner table with Emma, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Mom, I saw the police outside yesterday. What happened?" Emma asked, looking up from her plate. Linda sighed, unsure how to explain it. "There was a man in the neighborhood. I thought he looked suspicious, so I called the police." Emma frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. "Suspicious? What did he do?" "He didn't do anything, really. I thought he didn't belong here. But I guess I was wrong," Linda admitted, feeling a sense of discomfort wash over her. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly and she set down her fork. "Was it because he was black?" Linda's face flushed, and she looked away, feeling her daughter's gaze bore into her. "It wasn't just that," she said defensively. "He looked homeless, and I was just trying to be careful." Emma didn't say anything for a moment, but Linda could feel the judgment in her daughter's silence. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Mom, just because someone looks different or doesn't fit into our neighborhood doesn't mean they don't belong. You taught me that." The words hit Linda like a punch to the gut. She had always prided herself on raising Emma to be open-minded and accepting of others. But in this moment, she realized she had failed to practice what she preached. She had let her fear and prejudices dictate her actions, and now, even her daughter could see it. "You're right," Linda said quietly, feeling the weight of her admission. "I didn't think it through. I don't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." Emma's expression softened, but her eyes remained serious. "I know you were trying to protect us, but sometimes the way we see people isn't fair. We should give people a chance before we assume the worst." Linda nodded, her chest tight with a mix of guilt and regret. "I'll try to do better," she promised, though she wasn't sure how. The next day, as Linda sat by her window, her eyes were drawn once again to the spot where she had first seen Thomas. She couldn't stop thinking about him now, where he had come from, what had brought him back to this place, and how she had been so quick to label him as a threat. She felt compelled to know more, to understand the story behind the man she had misjudged. Driven by a strange sense of curiosity, and perhaps a need for redemption, Linda decided to ask around the neighborhood. She began with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jennings, who had lived there for decades and knew everyone who had ever come and gone from the community. When Linda asked about Thomas, Mrs. Jennings' face softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Oh, Thomas. I remember him well. Such a bright young man, full of potential. His family lived here for years, but after his parents passed away, he just drifted. He couldn't cope with the loss, and eventually he left. I hadn't heard from him in years until I saw him the other day." Linda's heart sank as she listened to Mrs. Jennings' words. She had no idea. Thomas wasn't just some vagrant passing through. He had roots here, a history. And yet, she had treated him like a stranger, an intruder. As Linda walked back to her house, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She felt a deep sense of shame, but also a strange desire to make things right. She had judged Thomas without knowing anything about him, and now she realized just how wrong she had been. Sitting in her living room that evening, Linda couldn't help but feel a shift within herself. The world she had once seen as so black and white, so clear-cut, now seemed more complicated, more nuanced. People weren't always what they seemed, and she had to confront the uncomfortable truth that her assumptions had been built on fear and prejudice. And for the first time in a long while, Linda felt uncertain. But she also felt something else, something new. The desire to change, to understand, to see the world through a different lens. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find Thomas. She owed him an apology, and perhaps in doing so, she could begin to make amends, not just with him, but with herself. The days that followed were filled with an unusual quiet for Linda. She kept her routine, running errands, making sure the house stayed in its usual pristine condition, and even attending the neighborhood association meeting, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself returning to thoughts of Thomas and how everything she had assumed about him had been wrong. His story had been far more complex than she had imagined, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had acted out of a place of deep-seated prejudice. It wasn't a word Linda liked to associate with herself. She always thought of herself as a fair person, someone who believed in giving people a chance. But this time, she had failed. The sense of guilt had grown into something she couldn't ignore. She had to know more about Thomas, about his past, and how he had ended up where he was. Linda decided to dig deeper, hoping to understand what had led him to return to this neighborhood after all these years. She convinced herself that it wasn't just about easing her guilt. It was about righting a wrong, about making sense of the world again. Linda's first stop was Mrs. Jennings' house. The elderly woman had always been a fixture in the community, and if anyone could give her more insight into Thomas's past, it was her. Linda rang the doorbell and was greeted with a warm, if somewhat surprised smile. "Well, Linda, what brings you by today?" Mrs. Jennings asked, stepping aside to let her in. Linda took a deep breath, unsure how to begin. "I've been thinking about Thomas, the man who was in the neighborhood the other day. You mentioned he grew up here?" Mrs. Jennings nodded slowly, her expression becoming more serious. "Oh yes, Thomas. Such a kind boy. It's a shame what happened to him. He used to live in that house down on the corner, where the new family moved in a few years ago. His parents, the Wilkins, were lovely people. They were well-liked, part of the community, but when they passed in that car accident, well, Thomas was never the same after that. He struggled to cope, poor thing." Linda felt a pang of guilt as Mrs. Jennings continued. She had assumed the worst about Thomas, not realizing that he had endured so much tragedy. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I didn't know any of this." "How could you? It's been years since anyone's seen him. After his parents passed, he tried to stay here, but it wasn't the same. He couldn't keep up with the house, couldn't keep his life together. Eventually, he left town, and no one knew where he went. It was heartbreaking. He was such a bright young man, had a scholarship to a good school and everything. But life, it can be cruel sometimes." Linda nodded, feeling a tightness in her chest. The picture she had painted of Thomas in her mind was crumbling. Instead of the threatening figure she had imagined, she now saw a man who had been broken by loss, someone who had returned to the only place that still held memories of better times. "What brought him back here, do you think?" Linda asked, her voice soft. Mrs. Jennings shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe he wanted to see what had become of the place, or maybe he was looking for some kind of closure. People come back to the places that mean something to them, don't they? Even when the memories are painful." Linda thanked Mrs. Jennings for her time and left feeling heavier than before. The more she learned about Thomas, the worse she felt. She had been so quick to judge, so certain that she was protecting her community from some imagined threat. But Thomas wasn't a threat. He was a man, broken by loss, just trying to find his way. Over the next few days, Linda couldn't stop thinking about Thomas's story. She found herself lingering at the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him again, but he didn't return. She didn't know what she would say if she saw him, but she knew she needed to apologize. She needed to make things right. Meanwhile, Emma had noticed her mother's growing preoccupation. One evening, as they sat together watching the news, Emma turned to her, her face filled with concern. "Mom, you've been kind of distant lately. Is everything okay?" Linda glanced at her daughter, feeling a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. Emma was sharp and intuitive, and Linda couldn't hide her inner turmoil from her. "I've just been thinking a lot," she admitted, "about that man, Thomas." Emma's expression softened. "Because of what happened? When you called the police?" Linda nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. I've learned more about him, about his past, and I feel awful for jumping to conclusions. He's not who I thought he was. He grew up here, Emma. His family lived just a few houses down from us. He's been through so much, and I judged him without knowing a thing about him." Emma listened quietly, her eyes full of empathy. "It sounds like you're trying to make up for it." "I want to," Linda said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I don't even know how. I called the police on him because I was scared, because I didn't understand, and now I feel like I need to do something to make things right." Emma placed a hand on her mother's arm, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's good that you realize that, Mom. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we move forward. Maybe you can talk to him, if you see him again." Linda smiled weakly, grateful for her daughter's support. "I hope I get the chance." Days turned into a week, and Linda continued to wrestle with her guilt. She began to reflect not just on her reaction to Thomas, but on how she had viewed the world for so long. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep her life neat and orderly. But now she realized that her need for control had blinded her to the complexities of people's lives. She had assumed that because Thomas looked different and out of place, he was dangerous. But in reality, he had been a part of this community long before she had ever moved in. He belonged here, perhaps more than she ever had. One afternoon, while Linda was out for a walk, she found herself drawn to the old house where Thomas's family had lived. It had been remodeled by the new owners, but traces of its former life remained: the outline of the original windows, the familiar curve of the driveway. Linda stood on the sidewalk, imagining Thomas as a young boy, playing in the yard, his parents waving from the porch. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her. "You're looking for something?" Linda turned around, startled, and there he was, Thomas. He was standing a few feet away, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his eyes tired but kind. She hadn't expected to see him, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. I didn't know you were here," she stammered. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's okay. I come by sometimes. It's the only place that still feels familiar." Linda swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment. This was her chance, her opportunity to say what she had been holding in for days. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I judged you. I saw you here the other day and I assumed the worst. I was wrong. I didn't know who you were, and I didn't take the time to understand. I'm so sorry." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, to Linda's surprise, he smiled, just a small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. "You're not the first person to make that mistake," he said quietly. "It happens more often than you'd think." Linda felt a lump rise in her throat. "That doesn't make it right," she whispered. "I'm trying to do better. I just want you to know that." Thomas nodded again, his eyes softening. "I appreciate that. And I get it. It's easy to judge when you don't know someone's story. But we all have our own struggles, our own history. You never really know what someone's going through." For the first time, Linda felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. She had expected anger, resentment, but instead, Thomas had met her apology with understanding. It was more than she deserved. As Thomas turned to leave, Linda found herself calling out to him. "Wait, if you ever want to talk, or if there's anything I can do to help." He paused, glancing back at her with a thoughtful expression. "Thanks," he said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that one day." And with that, he was gone, disappearing down the street, leaving Linda standing there, feeling both humbled and hopeful. She had made a mistake, a terrible, hurtful mistake. But maybe, just maybe, she had taken the first step toward making things right. The days passed, and though Linda had apologized to Thomas, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't done enough. Her words, though sincere, seemed too small in the face of the assumptions she had made and the damage she may have caused. She wanted to do more, not just to ease her own conscience, but to truly understand and help Thomas in whatever way she could. The conversation they had shared outside his old house replayed in her mind. His acceptance of her apology had been calm and gracious, but there was an underlying sadness in his words, a lifetime of being misunderstood and judged. Linda couldn't imagine how many times he had been in similar situations, how often people had looked at him and seen only what they feared, not the person he truly was. Linda found herself thinking about what Thomas had said, about everyone having their own struggles and histories. It rang true, but it also made her realize how little she knew about those struggles. For all her curiosity, she still hadn't learned the full extent of Thomas's story, and a part of her knew she wouldn't be at peace until she did. One afternoon, Linda decided to take another walk around the neighborhood. It had become a habit in the past few weeks, not only as a way to clear her head, but also in the hope of running into Thomas again. She didn't know what she would say if she saw him, but she felt drawn to the idea of trying to help him, of making a difference in a life she had nearly pushed further into the margins. As she strolled down the familiar streets, the late autumn air crisp against her skin, she saw a figure sitting on a bench at the small park nearby. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Thomas. His posture was slouched, his backpack resting beside him, and he stared out at the park with an expression that was both thoughtful and heavy with emotion. Linda hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach. What if he didn't want to talk? What if he needed his space? But something inside her urged her forward. She had to try. "Thomas?" she called softly as she walked toward him. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of surprise and mild curiosity. "Linda," he said, his voice calm as always. She gave him a small, tentative smile as she came closer. "Mind if I sit with you?" He shrugged, gesturing to the space beside him on the bench. "Sure." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Linda glanced at Thomas, unsure of how to start, but determined not to let the conversation falter. There was so much she wanted to say, but she didn't know where to begin. She wanted to ask about his life, about the pain he had endured, but she also didn't want to pry. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her voice soft, "about how everyone has their own story, their own struggles." Thomas nodded, but he didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. "I realize that I've spent so much time trying to keep everything in my life perfect, controlled, and when something doesn't fit that image, I react out of fear. But I've been wrong. I've been blind to what other people are going through, especially you." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression neutral but his eyes searching. "You're not the only one who reacts that way," he said quietly. "People fear what they don't understand. It's human nature, I guess." "But that doesn't make it right," Linda insisted, feeling a surge of emotion rise within her. "It doesn't excuse the way I treated you. I didn't know you, and instead of trying to understand, I assumed the worst. And I'm sorry for that. I want to do better." Thomas sighed, his gaze drifting back to the park in front of them. "You're trying. That's more than most people do." Linda bit her lip, unsure how to respond. There was so much more she wanted to say, but the weight of it all felt overwhelming. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured after a moment. He nodded, still staring ahead. "What brought you back here, after all these years?" Thomas was silent for a while, as if weighing his answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I don't really know. I guess I just needed to see this place again. Needed to remind myself that I had a life before everything fell apart." Linda listened carefully, sensing that he was opening up more than before. "You must have been really close to your parents," she said gently. Thomas nodded, his eyes darkening with the weight of memory. "They were everything to me. My dad, he was a teacher. My mom, she worked at the library. They were simple people, but they gave me a good life. When I lost them, it felt like the ground was pulled out from under me." Linda's heart ached as she listened to him. She had always had Mark and Emma to lean on when times were tough. The thought of losing them, of losing everything familiar and loved, was unimaginable. "I couldn't handle it," Thomas continued, his voice tight with emotion. "I tried to stay here, keep the house running, but every corner, every room reminded me of them. It was too much. Eventually, I just walked away. From everything." Linda swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I can't even imagine how hard that must have been for you." Thomas shrugged, but it was clear that the pain was still fresh, even after all these years. "It was what it was. I made some bad decisions after that. Things spiraled out of control, and before I knew it, I was lost. I never really found my way back." Linda nodded, feeling a deep sense of empathy. "But you came back here. That means something, doesn't it? Maybe you were looking for closure, or maybe you were trying to find a piece of yourself that you lost." Thomas turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if her words had struck a chord. "Maybe," he said softly. "I don't know. I just know that I needed to come back, even if I didn't know what I was looking for." Linda felt a deep connection to him in that moment, as if they were both standing at the edge of something significant, something that had the potential to change them both. She wanted to help him, to offer him some kind of hope or support, but she didn't know how. "If there's anything I can do," she began, her voice tentative. "Anything at all, just let me know. I don't want to just apologize and walk away. I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem." Thomas looked at her for a long time, his gaze thoughtful and contemplative. Finally he nodded. "Maybe there is something you can do." Linda's heart raced. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need a second chance. A chance to start over. I don't want to be stuck in this limbo anymore, wandering from place to place with no direction. I need help, getting back on my feet." Linda felt a surge of determination. "I'll help you," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, I'll do what I can." Thomas looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You really mean that?" "Yes," Linda said, without hesitation. "I mean it." For the first time since she had met him, Thomas's expression softened into something like hope. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. They sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of their conversation settling around them like a blanket. For Linda, the realization that she could make a difference in Thomas's life gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She had made a mistake, an enormous, hurtful mistake. But now, she had the opportunity to help make things right. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Linda stood up and smiled at Thomas. "I'll be in touch," she said. "We'll figure this out together." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Linda. I appreciate it." Linda walked away from the park that evening feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Helping Thomas find his way back wasn't just about redemption for her. It was about doing what was right. And maybe, just maybe, in helping him, she would also find a way to heal the cracks in her own life. The following weeks were a whirlwind of action. As Linda set her plan into motion, she had made a promise to Thomas, and she was determined to keep it. This wasn't just about easing her own guilt anymore. It was about helping someone who had been forgotten by the very community that once embraced him. Linda knew that if she was going to make a difference, she had to go beyond a simple apology. She had to show that people could change, that they could open their hearts and rebuild bridges they had once destroyed. Her first step was reaching out to some of the local organizations that help people in difficult circumstances. She knew that Thomas needed more than just emotional support. He needed practical help to get back on his feet. Employment, housing, access to social services, all of these were essential if he was going to make a fresh start. Linda's persistence paid off. Through a contact at the community center, she learned about a local program designed to assist people who were homeless or struggling with housing insecurity. They provided temporary housing, job training, and resources to help people re-enter the workforce. It was exactly what Thomas needed, but the program had a long waiting list. Linda, however, wasn't one to be easily deterred. She made calls, set up meetings, and even met with the director of the program to explain Thomas's situation. Her passion and determination struck a chord, and before long she had secured him a spot. It wasn't permanent housing, but it was a step in the right direction. When Linda told Thomas about the program, he was initially hesitant. He had spent so long drifting from place to place, relying on himself, that the idea of accepting help felt foreign to him. But Linda's insistence and the sincerity in her eyes eventually broke through his reservations. "You've been on your own for so long," Linda told him gently, "but you don't have to do this alone anymore. You deserve a chance, Thomas. Let me help you take it." He had finally agreed, though Linda could see the uncertainty in his eyes. She didn't blame him. Trust didn't come easy when you'd been let down by life so many times before. The day Thomas moved into the temporary housing was bittersweet. It was a small apartment, clean and simple, but to him, it must have felt like a palace. Linda helped him settle in, bringing a few essentials, bedding, dishes, and some groceries to get him started. She tried not to make it feel like charity, though she could sense that Thomas still felt uncomfortable with the idea of being helped. "I know this is new for you," Linda said as they unpacked together. "But this is just the beginning. You'll be back on your feet in no time, and you won't need anyone's help." Thomas gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate what you're doing for me, I really do. But it's hard not to feel like I'm taking advantage." "You're not," Linda said firmly. "You're letting someone be there for you, the way you've deserved all along. You're giving me the chance to do something good, to make up for my mistakes. And that's not something I take lightly." Thomas nodded, though Linda could tell it would take time for him to fully accept her words. Trust wasn't built overnight, especially not after the years of hardship he had faced. But this was a step forward, and that was what mattered. As the weeks went on, Linda and Thomas developed an unexpected friendship. They met regularly, sometimes over coffee, other times just for a walk around the park. Thomas began to open up more about his past, about the years he had spent lost and wandering after his parents' death. He told her about the people he had met along the way, some kind, others cruel, and the lessons he had learned from both. Linda, in turn, shared pieces of her own life. Her marriage to Mark, her struggles to connect with Emma as she grew older, and her own fears and insecurities. It was strange, she thought, how easily they had fallen into this rhythm. Two people from completely different worlds, finding common ground in their shared vulnerability. Through it all, Linda saw a gradual change in Thomas. The weight on his shoulders seemed to lighten, if only slightly. He started attending job training workshops through the program, and though progress was slow, it was progress nonetheless. Linda could see a spark of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and it filled her with a deep sense of satisfaction. Helping Thomas wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about seeing him thrive, about giving him the future he deserved. One day, as they sat in the park, Thomas turned to Linda with a thoughtful expression. "You've done a lot for me," he said. More than I ever expected. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to repay me, Linda said with a smile. Seeing you get your life back on track is enough. Thomas nodded, but his eyes were serious. I don't mean financially or anything like that. I mean, you've helped me find hope again. I didn't think that was possible. I thought I was done, that my life had hit a dead end, but you reminded me that there's still something left for me in this world. Linda felt a lump in her throat at his words. She had never expected this. Never expected that helping Thomas would lead to something so profound. I'm glad I could help you see that, she said softly. But you're the one who's doing the hard work, Thomas. I'm just here to support you. As the months passed, Thomas continued to make strides. He found a part-time job at a local bookstore, a small but significant victory. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it gave him a sense of purpose. Slowly, he was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. But the real turning point came one evening when the community held a neighborhood event, a charity fundraiser for the local shelter. Linda had been helping organize the event, and she knew that it would be the perfect opportunity for the neighborhood to see Thomas in a new light. This was the moment, she realized, when she could help him truly re-enter the community that had once been his home. Linda invited Thomas to the event, though she wasn't sure if he would come. She understood that it must have been difficult for him to face the people who had once been his neighbors, the people who had likely forgotten him, or worse, who had judged him the way Linda had. To her surprise, on the evening of the fundraiser, Thomas arrived. He was dressed simply, but he looked clean and well put together, his eyes filled with a mix of nervousness and determination. Linda greeted him with a warm smile, feeling a swell of pride in how far he had come. As the evening went on, Linda introduced Thomas to some of the people in the neighborhood. At first, there were awkward glances, the kind of hesitance that comes from not knowing how to place someone in the context of your world. But as Thomas spoke, as he shared bits of his story, the tension began to fade. Slowly, people started to see him not as the homeless man from the park, but as Thomas, the man who had once lived among them, who had lost everything and was now finding his way back. By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. The walls that had once separated Thomas from the community had begun to crumble. He had reintroduced himself, not as a stranger or an outsider, but as a part of the fabric of their world. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. As the night drew to a close, Linda and Thomas stood together, watching the last of the guests leave. You did it, Linda said quietly. You're part of this community again. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I couldn't have done it without you, he said. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Linda shook her head. You deserved that chance all along. I just helped you find it. They stood in silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. For Linda, it was a journey of redemption, of learning to confront her own prejudices and fears, and of realizing that true change came from understanding and compassion. For Thomas, it was a journey of survival and hope, of finding his way back from the edge and reclaiming the life he had once lost. As they said their goodbyes, Linda felt a deep sense of closure. She had made mistakes, serious ones, but she had also made amends. And in doing so, she had not only helped Thomas find his way back, she had also found a new sense of purpose for herself. In the end, Linda realized that life wasn't about maintaining control or keeping everything perfect. It was about connection, about understanding the people around you, and about recognizing that everyone had a story worth hearing. And as she watched Thomas walk away that night, his head held high, Linda knew that she had not only helped him heal, she had helped heal a part of herself as well.